It is the second week of July. Thank you for continuing working through Zion's Grow at Home study plan with me. This week, we learn about two more Old Testament history books, Judges and Ruth. We cover four more Exodus-era Bible events, describing Israel's departure from Egypt and their journey to Mount Sinai. And we'll continue studying Bible teachings with a look at the second commandment. We begin by looking at two Old Testament history books, Judges and Ruth. Last week's book, Joshua, describes Israel's occupying of the promised land of Canaan. But after Joshua dies, there seems to be a vacuum of leadership. The book of Judges shows Israel caught in a tragic cycle of both sinful rebellion and God's gracious rescue. The people sin, falling away from God, and adopting the sinful practices of the people they left alive in the land. And God punishes his people by allowing their pagan neighbors to harass them. The Israelites remember their God and cry out for help. And in loving mercy, God raises up a judge, a leader, to rescue his sinful people. All is well until the judge dies. And then God's people fall away again, and the whole tragic cycle starts over. While you will read many memorable stories in Judges, like Ehud, the left-handed judge, literally sticking it to the king of Moab, or Samson slaughtering 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, these events and many others in Judges are some of the darkest and disturbing in the Bible. The reason why is mentioned at the end of the book. In those days, there was not a king in Israel. Each one would do what was right in his own eyes. Within these dark days of Israel, there is a Gentile widow from Moab named Ruth, who shows amazing faithfulness and service to her Israelite mother-in-law, Naomi. She says Naomi's God will be her God and follows her back to live in Bethlehem. She ends up marrying Naomi's relative, Boaz. The book ends by mentioning that Ruth will be the great-grandmother of King David, which means she will also be an ancestress of Jesus also. Our four Bible events this week take us from Egypt to Mount Sinai. In Exodus 14, we will read what could be called the primary saving event of the Old Testament. Last week, we left off with Israel celebrating the Passover to find deliverance from the 10th plague against the firstborn of Egypt. Pharaoh did agree to let the Israelites leave Egypt, but he soon changed his mind. Now stuck between Pharaoh's advancing army and a large sea, Israel quickly lost faith in God's saving power. But God parts the sea, allowing the Israelites to cross and then drowning Pharaoh's army behind. Surely, after seeing God's might in the 10 plagues, and now this miraculous water crossing, you would think the Israelites would never doubt God's love for them again. Well, they can't even make it to chapter 16. Almost immediately, they start complaining about their food situation and desire to be back in Egypt with their pots of meat. God is patient with them and promises to feed them with quail in the evening and a strange bread on the ground in the morning. They call it manna, which means, what is it? Now, they will trust God, right? In chapter 17, they get thirsty and complain to Moses, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst?" Yes, Israel's complaining against Moses and against God will be a constant theme for the next 40 years. God tells Moses to strike a rock and water comes out. This reading also tells of a battle with the Amalekites and how Aaron and Hur hold up Moses' arms so Israel will be victorious. Even as Israel complains, God responds with grace and mercy. He is patient with them, but his patience will not last forever. In Exodus chapter 18, Moses' father-in-law Jethro shows up because he had heard about God's dramatic rescue of Israel from Egypt. He sees his son-in-law buried under the daily management of such a large group of people and offers the helpful advice of delegating the leadership out to other capable men, placing them in charge of groups of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Smart advice for anyone serving in leadership. God doesn't expect us to carry the weight alone. We continue our study of the Ten Commandments with a look at the second commandment. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Luther's meaning to the second commandment begins a pattern of both telling us what the commandment forbids us to do, but also what it desires us to do. Remember, we can sin by doing evil, but we can also sin by not doing good. Question 17 reminds us that God's name is more than just what we label God. It includes all that God has revealed about himself. Question 18 helps us understand what we mean by cursing, swearing, using witchcraft, lying, and deceiving by God's name. Question 19 teaches us that there are appropriate times to swear, and even Jesus was placed under oath in Matthew chapter 26. Question 20 runs us through the list of appropriate ways to use God's name. If you started with me in June and have made it this far into our journey, chances are your time in God's Word is becoming a habit that hopefully you look forward to. Daily time in God's Word is a great habit to get into. May God bless your time this week as you remain in His Word.